Good morning, everyone. I'm very sad to not be in Korea physically. I have a lot of travel and always struggle to prioritize. And I was feeling okay about this until I saw some familiar faces on this Zoom call. And now I feel regret for not going, but hopefully I can share some research with you remotely. And hopefully I can debug all the remote presentation technical issues so that the other speakers have a smooth experience for the rest of the workshop. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and thank you for organizing the workshop. A lot of work goes into wrangling speakers and backups and everything, and so I appreciate that. It's a huge amount of effort. So in the time I have today with you, really I want to briefly introduce who we are, and to the topic of the workshop, I want to talk about three key areas of research that we work in that I guess aligns with some of the themes of what was talked about in the introduction to this workshop. I'll just be giving a high-level overview of the key takeaways and approaches. I'm not going to go into deep technical detail, but happy to discuss those in more detail. And then I want to finish by, I guess, a little bit of a rant about how we conduct research in this area, which I think is pertinent to the topic of really rethinking how the robotics community is considering all of these different techniques and how we are conducting and rewarding research in the field. So to briefly introduce ourselves, so I am privileged to be joint director of a robotics research center called the QUT Center for Robotics. We are in Brisbane, Australia, over 100 people doing all sorts of fun and interesting and impactful robotics research. So we work all the way from blue sky fundamental research to highly applied, highly commercialized research, and it's in autonomous systems in just about every single domain. So unmanned aerial systems in our skies, on our oceans, deep underneath our oceans, on roads, off roads, on farms, in the environment, and even deep underground in mine sites and in surgical theaters. We have both fundamental and applied projects in all of these areas. And you learn a lot, often very painfully, about what's needed to translate some of this very promising fundamental research that we're talking about in this workshop into systems that actually work in deployed, autonomous, long-term embodied systems. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those learnings later in the talk. My research group that I lead, we are driven by scientific curiosity, but we are also driven by industry problems. So industry, government, startups, whoever they are, come to us with a specific problem that they'd like us to solve. And so we combine both of these motivations. We draw a lot of inspiration from biology. We draw a lot of inspiration from the neuroscience underlying biological systems. We use a lot of classical and modern learning-based approaches, especially neural network-based approaches. We always test things on embodied robots in the real world. These systems never work the first few dozen times, as anyone who's worked on real robots can attest to. And it's in this iterative process of improving these systems that we learn a lot about what it takes to actually get these systems to work. And we're sort of well known for some, I guess, legacy achievements in robotics, especially in the mapping and navigation domain. So long-term online SLAM experiments using biologically inspired systems like rat SLAM, and large-scale visual mapping experiments like mapping a suburb, which was at the time the largest environment mapped with a vision-only SLAM system. So three areas of research that I'll just highlight really to generate discussion for this workshop. So the first is in the area of dynamic vision sensors. This is led by my colleague, Toby Fisher. You may know these more colloquially as event cameras. These are those cameras that detect the change in intensity in the scene and the polarity of that change. So you can see a video here of a standard camera feed in the middle column, and on the right you can see the polarity of the events, the changes in pixel intensity that are being detected by one of these event cameras, and they have been binned over a sort of a certain time period. These are somewhat more biologically relevant visual sensors. They're not like the human eye or the eyes of animals, but they are in some ways closer in function to what we think nature does. One of the really interesting things that you can do with these sensors, and this is, I guess, to the theme of thinking about how we use sensory input, is that you can take the input from this feed and you can reconstruct grayscale images from these event streams. But the time interval over which you reconstruct the image is arbitrary. So you can take events from these event cameras from a 1 millisecond period, or a 10 millisecond period, or a 2000 millisecond period. And each time you choose a different time window to reconstruct an image, you get a different image out. And so one of the things that we're doing in this area is looking at how we can have multiple visual processing pathways of these event streams that integrate events into imagery at different temporal scales, and then looking at how we can ensemble those different approaches together to generate, in this case, visual place recognition or localization outcomes for a robot system. So this is a results page. The performance graph is on the left of this slide. The vertical axis is performance. So higher up on the vertical axis is better performance. So the ensemble method is the one shown in the black dot and dashed line, and it is constant across the entire horizontal axis. The horizontal axis is the reconstruction window that we are using to reconstruct images from these event camera streams. And because the ensemble method takes reconstructions at all different timescales, it has a single performance point, which is why you have a horizontal line. And you can see that the performance of this ensemble-based approach is superior to a number of alternative approaches that only do image reconstruction and localization off a single time scale. So you get consistency in performance and significantly improved performance from this ensemble approach to event camera-based perception. One of the things we're looking at, again, to the idea of sparse vision and only using the sensory input that you really need, is the idea of salience and sparse pixel selection. And so throughout the presentation, if you want more details, all the publication references at the bottom of the slide, you can look these up, or you can reach out and chat to us. So at the bottom right, we have an image which shows a simple salience-based process whereby we detect or assess that event camera pixels are salient based on the variance in the event frequency generated at a particular pixel location in the image sensor. So all of these blue little circular dots are pixels in the image plane that are perceived as particularly salient. To avoid all of the salient pixels being in one location in the image frame, we have some local self-suppression. So if you find a particularly salient pixel, you can't find a salient pixel in the vicinity of that. And that's why you get a nice even spread. So this is another performance graph showing what happens when you use these salience-based measures for localization and visual place recognition. So this is a performance graph. Once again, the vertical axis, higher up on the vertical axis is better performance. And on the horizontal axis, we have the number of pixels that are being used by the system. So we're not using the full 100,000 pixels from the sensor. We're using 1, 2, 5, 10, etc. pixels. There are really two interesting key takeaways from this graph. So the first is the salient performance is shown in the blue columns, and the picking pixels at random without a salience measure is shown in the orange. So the blue performance, which represents the salient pixels, using pixels that are perceived as being particularly salient, you get a big performance boost. The other really interesting thing from this graph in terms of sparsity of perception is that you get quite good absolute performance. So the vertical axis performance is actually recall at 99% precision, which is a standard measure used in localization and place recognition research. Using as small as 5 or 10 pixels in the image, you get quite good absolute performance. And so that's very interesting in terms of what sensory input do you actually need. And we have a long history of working in this area of sparse perception. The second area, when we're talking about trying to come up with computationally efficient, hopefully low latency and low energy frameworks for robotics, is in the area of spiking neural networks. So this is broadly the area of modeling in software neural networks that don't have continuous activation values for the neurons in the network, but instead have a spiking pattern. So neurons spike rather than have a particular value. And these are, again, not exactly the same as biological neurons found in natural brains, but is a little bit more thematically aligned with what we find in nature. So we're working with a number of collaborators, including Intel, who has their own neuromorphic hardware platform called Loihi. There are a number of neuromorphic platforms. This is just one of them. And what we've done is we've adapted, everyone starts with character recognition as your standard task. So what we've done is adapted character recognition pipelines using spiking neural networks to do the task of visual place recognition. So this is looking at an image and trying to match that image to images in a map or database. So you can see the structure of the network on the right, an image, which is represented by this 3:2 grayscale image at the top of the middle column, is turned into firing rates in the input neurons of this network, which is then fed through a network. And the main learning mechanism in this network is spike timing dependent plasticity. But there's a number of other mechanisms we need to implement to make the system actually performance, which are in the paper, but I won't go into much detail about those. So one of the really promising things about these networks is these are very small networks that are highly performant at tasks like localization and visual place recognition. So one of the things that this team, so this is Samaya and Toby, have done recently is used ensembles of lots of little modular spiking neural networks, where each spiking neural network is only responsible for learning about the places or locations in one particular part of the world. And then you ensemble a bunch, like hundreds or thousands or potentially millions or billions of these small modular networks together, and you can come up with a very large scale, highly performant localization system. And so the most recent work for this was published in ICRA and presented a few weeks ago in London. But this is really, really exciting and particularly interesting to, I think, the introduction to this workshop is the ways in which spiking neural network backends perform and fail are very different to the ways that the conventional deep learning pipelines that we also use extensively work. And so there's a lot of interesting complementarity in terms of these capabilities. The third body of work I want to talk about is the idea of doing more with less. And in this case, we're trying to do more in terms of localization systems, rather than trying to make a single localization system that is perfect, looking at how you can develop a framework that is able to pair multiple localization systems together that are particularly performant. And so this is work jointly with funded by Amazon, and I guess has broad relevance to low-cost robotics. So what we're trying to do in this system or in this work is come up with localization methods that we can pair together that result in an improvement in performance over just using a single method. And it's always interesting to think about the things that didn't work. So this is quite a long journey. So one of the things we tried to do is predict outright from input imagery, so the imagery coming into the robot, which localization method would work well. And this did not work at all. One of the ways that does work, but is computationally intractable, is you run all your localization methods in parallel, and then you introspect which ones are working well, and you choose to use those ones. That works, but is computationally a nightmare because you're running 10 or 20 localization methods in parallel, which is not really feasible for a commercially deployed system. Another method we tried was predicting based on the input sensory input, the pair of localization methods that would work together best. That did not work as well. And the other thing we tried was running a baseline method and predicting based on the input image, so the sensory input of the robot, which additional method to add to it to improve performance. And that did not work as well. So the method that did work, and this was presented at ICRA a few weeks ago in London, was you run your sensory input, in this case, it's a visual image, through a standard localization system or place recognition system. In this case, it's NetVLAD, and NetVLAD will output an output that you can then use in a place recognition system. In this case, we use the intermediate output of that system, which is a difference vector, which is basically how similar the output of NetVLAD is to all the images in the reference database. And we use that as the training target for predicting which methods will complement NetVLAD the best. And this was the magic sauce, which resulted in very substantial improvement. So the key was moving from predicting based directly on the visual input or the sensory input from the robot and moving to predicting based on the intermediate output of a localization system, which is a really interesting insight from our perspective. And performance works really well. Once again, all the details are in the paper, but you get a very strong improvement in performance. And there's lots of interesting observations. So the system tends to have favorite combinations of techniques in different data sets and different environments. And the dominant pairs of techniques that work well within one particular data set tend to be fairly consistent within that data set. Whether that's an interesting insight or a revelation that the data sets we use to train these systems and benchmark these systems are not really that diverse, I will leave to the panel discussion later today. But interesting insights, and this work is continuing. All right, in the last sort of 5 minutes of my talk, I've presented 3 areas of work we're looking at in terms of efficient, low latency, bio-inspired approaches to perception and localization for robots. I want to talk a little bit about how we're conducting robotics research as well. So in my group, we're particularly interested in really positioning for autonomy for robots. So scaling these systems up in time and space. So systems that can work in a surgical robotics theater at millimeter precisions, systems that can work at microsecond latencies, all the way to global positioning systems and systems that can work for long periods of time, many years in the real world. And we've come up with really 3 key things or insights into how we conduct and reward and publish robotics research that I think are pertinent to the topic of today's workshop. I just want to cover the last one, which is around introspective capability of learning systems for robotics and of robot autonomy in general. So this is a simple example. Let's say you are designing a positioning system for an autonomous vehicle or a drone. You have a choice of 2 systems. System 1 is a positioning system that is very performant 99.9% of the time, but when it's failing, it doesn't have any self-diagnosis capability. So it doesn't understand when it's not performing well. System 2 only works 99% of the time. So the joke I always tell is System 2 is probably not going to get published in CVPR or ICRA, but System 2 has one key advantage. When it's not working, it's able to self-diagnose 99% of the time that it's not working, that it is not working. If you're trying to make a choice between these 2 systems in any sort of safety or operationally critical application, System 2 is far superior to System 1, even though this isn't something necessarily that the research community would reward, because using System 2, you are unknowingly working off incorrect positioning information only a very tiny fraction of the time. This is an area that we're doing a lot of work in. We've pivoted a lot of our research group to working in this area of verification and integrity and explainability of these systems. This is work led by researchers like Helen in our group. And why is knowing when you don't know significant? Well, if you're thinking about learning and autonomy in systems that actually work, if a system knows it's not performing well, it can stop. If a system knows that it's not performing well, it can hand off collaboration to a human collaborator. And we know increasingly we're moving away from full automation to collaborative automation in the robotics and AI space. If you're in a navigation space, just to pick one example, you can use this understanding that you don't know what you're doing to trigger and update your existing representations. You might remap your environment, for example. And now that we do have end-to-end learning capabilities, if you know that you're really, really struggling, you can trigger a complete end-to-end relearning of what you're doing from scratch. So this is an example. Again, this was a paper presented, another paper presented at ICRA this year. This is Helen's work, where we are using this knowing when you don't know approach to build on top of autonomous vehicle localization systems. And basically we have a system that takes the estimates from that system, so the position estimates from that system, and assess whether that position estimate is likely to be correct or not. And using this approach, you can improve the overall performance of the localization system. But most importantly, your system can understand when it's not working well, and you can take alternative or fail-safe actions. This is also something we're working on in the surgical domain. So this is another paper presented at ICRA a few weeks ago, where we're looking at a system that knows when it doesn't know in the context of navigation of a surgical robot. Toolpoint. This is work led by a PhD student, Morgan. And again, this allows the robot to potentially stop itself if it doesn't have confidence in what it's doing. And it also enhances collaboration with surgeons. This robot would not be fully autonomous. It would be working collaboratively with some of the surgeons that we work with. And this would enable the system to know particularly how to shape that collaboration. We're working on lots of other stuff, just to mention, in case anyone's interested in discussing these things offline. If you want open source code, survey papers from any of this work, there are publication references throughout the talk. We have lots of other research projects. We are always hiring, and we have a lot of career development programs as well, including my Hacking Academia program. Please look us up online. And also another shameless plug, this is why I'm so sympathetic. After a few years of we used to organize a lot of workshops, we took a little bit of a break, but we have another workshop at IROS this year. Thematically, I don't think it's that dissimilar to the workshop we're at today, which is really about closing the loop between what we do in research and what is actually going to eventually help industry, government, the public sector actually adopt robots and trust robots. And so we call it closing the loop on localization. This is now open for papers and submissions. We've got a great lineup of speakers and competitions and panels and debates and even a social event. So it should be a really great event. So look that up if you're interested. Thank you to all our funding supporters, all of our collaborators from around the world. And if you want to find out more about working with our center, please reach out to Jesse. Here's the picture on the left of this slide. He's at RSS this week in person. And thank you to the organizers again, and I hope that was of interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. So we have about 5 minutes for questions and answers. I hope you have time for that. So the floor is open. If you have any questions, please indicate to Sasyank over here, and then he will approach you with the microphone.
Hey, Mike. I don't know, can you see me? No, I guess you can't, right?
I can hear you and recognize you.
Yeah, so you know who it is. You mentioned that the spiking neural networks fail in a different way to the deep learning systems and they could be complementary. Could you speak a bit more about that? I think that's really interesting.
Sure. So the question was about how spiking neural networks are complementary and fail and succeed in different ways to conventional deep nets. I won't share all of the details because we think we're onto a really exciting thing, but broadly speaking, the deep networks in the localization domain, their failure modes are highly correlated. So if you're, let's say it's a localization system on an autonomous vehicle, if you get into a particularly problematic part of the environment, the system will fail and it will continue to fail in a correlated manner. So from one location to the next adjacent location, it has a high likelihood of continuing to fail for a period of time. From what we've seen in the spiking neural network approaches that we're using for localization, they have much less correlation, I guess, in their failure mode. So even if the system in absolute benchmark terms is worse, its actual utility for an operationally critical task like autonomous vehicle localization is potentially much higher because it doesn't have that pathological correlated failure modes. And so we're in the early days of exploring that, but that's really exciting because it has value even if the absolute performance of the system isn't as good as the deep learning based approach.
Any other questions?
Thanks for your representation. I think you're really interested in localization tasks. So why don't you think to combine the IMU, inertial measurement unit? Do you have any ideas about the sensor?
Sure. So we are, I guess, and this will come up in the topic of the workshop, I think, time and time again. So it's always useful to state the perspective and interests of all groups when they're doing research. So some groups in our field are purely interested in modeling biology and seeing how accurate and predictive those models can be. Some groups are purely interested in highly performing commercial systems and don't really care about the biology inspiration. And then there's everyone in between. So we're really in the middle there. We care about both. We opportunistically use other sensors like GPS, IMU, barometers, Wi-Fi signals. We will opportunistically use that if the commercial application that we're working on justifies the usage of that sensor. But from a scientific perspective, we're also interested in what you can do without necessarily having access to all of those sensors. And there's lots of applications where you might not be able to assume that you have consistent access to sensors like an IMU. And then IMUs are a huge range, right? You can get very expensive, very accurate IMUs that negate the need for a lot of the other localization systems, but they are quite expensive. Some of them are security restricted as well. And then you have other IMUs which will drift and where you do need those other sensing modalities. So we have lots of projects that do use IMUs, but it depends on the commercial realities of the particular project in question.